I turned 35 years old sitting in a financial advisor's office staring at a net worth statement with 7 figures on it. And the strangest part of that entire moment wasn't the number itself. It was how unremarkable getting there had actually felt while it was happening. Picture the office for a second, because I still can. Beige walls, a slightly too cold air conditioner, a guy named Gary clicking through a spreadsheet on a monitor angled just enough that I had to lean to see it. No confetti, no string quartet. Just Gary, the air conditioner, and a number that took me a full 10 seconds to actually read correctly the first time. There was no single brilliant trade, no inheritance, no overnight business that took off. Just a long string of small, almost invisible habits, repeated for years, quietly compounding in the background, while I went about an otherwise completely ordinary life. I went back recently and actually tried to count them, every small decision that contributed something to that number on the page. I landed on 25. Some of them took 30 seconds. None of them felt significant in the moment. All 25 of them together built something I genuinely didn't see coming until it had already arrived. The first 5 micro habits all live in the same general neighborhood, the actual earning side of the equation, because no amount of disciplined spending fixes an income that's stuck standing still for a decade. Micro habit 1. Negotiating every single job offer, every time, without exception, even when the offer already sounded perfectly reasonable. I used to accept the first number out of pure relief that someone wanted to hire me at all. The habit became simply asking, politely, whether there was room to discuss it, almost every single time there was. That one small question compounded across multiple job changes into a meaningfully different salary trajectory than the guy who just said, "Thank you," and signed. The first time I actually did this, my voice noticeably shook asking the question, and the recruiter paused just long enough to make me regret opening my mouth at all. Then she said almost casually, "Let me check," and came back with a number considerably higher than the original offer. The shaking voice was worth it. It's been worth it every single time since, even on the offers where the answer came back no. Picture it with me for a second. A grown man, in a blazer he bought specifically for the occasion, hands slightly clammy, asking a perfectly pleasant stranger whether there's any flexibility on the number. His voice cracked exactly once, right on the word flexibility. That was me, multiple times. I never once got more graceful at the asking part. I just got considerably wealthier from doing it anyway. Micro habit 2. Documenting wins as they happened instead of trying to remember them under pressure during an annual review. A simple running note, updated the same week, something good actually happened. Not reconstructed from memory 6 months later while sweating across a desk from a manager. Walking into a raise conversation with specifics beats walking in with a vague feeling that you'd probably done a decent job. I sat across from a manager once with 3 specific numbers in hand, dollar figures, and timelines tied directly to projects I'd led. A coworker in the same review cycle offered only a general sense that he'd been pretty solid this year. We got noticeably different outcomes anyway. He wasn't less capable than me. He just hadn't been keeping score, and reviews tend to reward the guy who can prove it over the guy who can only feel it. Micro habit 3. Treating every raise as partially invisible. A fixed percentage of every single increase got redirected immediately before the new number ever touched my regular spending account, so lifestyle crept up slower than income did. The gap between the two is, quietly, where almost all of this started. I genuinely never felt deprived doing this, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. The portion of every raise that actually reached my regular life still felt like a raise, still bought a slightly nicer dinner out, still loosened something that had felt tight before. The other portion just quietly vanished into an account I'd basically forgotten was growing, the same way background noise stops registering once you've lived with it long enough. Microhabit 4. Building one monetizable skill outside my main job, slowly, on weekends, years before it ever produced meaningful income. It felt pointless for a long stretch. It eventually became a second, smaller income stream that existed entirely outside my employer's control, immune to layoffs, raises, or anyone else's budget decisions. The first year of this produced almost nothing worth mentioning, a handful of small jobs that barely covered the cost of the equipment I'd bought to do them. I kept going anyway, mostly out of stubbornness rather than any clear evidence it would eventually pay off. The second year quietly outpaced the first by a wide margin, and by the third, that side skill was contributing a meaningful slice of total income, completely separate from whatever was happening at my day job. My wife referred to that first year, lovingly, as the expensive hobbies, which, frankly, was an accurate label at the time. I'd spend a Saturday morning on it, come back smelling faintly of sawdust or printer ink depending on the week, and report earnings that wouldn't have covered the gas to get there. She stopped calling it a hobby somewhere around year 3, right around the time it quietly started out earning a few of my actual paychecks. Microhabit 5. Treating courses, certifications, and skill building as investments with an expected return, not expenses to feel guilty about. I ran rough math on each one before committing, asking what it would need to earn back to be worth it. Most paid for themselves within a year. A few didn't, and getting comfortable with a few quiet failures turned out to be part of the actual habit. One certification in particular sat completely unused for nearly 2 years after I earned it, a quiet embarrassment every time I noticed the framed paper on the wall. It eventually became the exact qualification that opened a door nothing else on my resume could have, at precisely the moment I needed it to. I couldn't have predicted that timing. The habit wasn't predicting it. The habit was simply staying willing to invest in myself even when the return wasn't obvious yet. The first 5 micro-habits were about getting more money to show up in the first place. The next 5 are about making sure it actually stuck around once it did, because a bigger income with the same old leaks just means a bigger leak, dressed up to look like progress. Micro-habit 6. Automating savings the same day every paycheck landed before the money had a chance to feel like mine to spend. This sounds almost identical to advice you've heard 100 times. And it is, because it's genuinely one of the few pieces of common financial advice that actually holds up under real pressure. The habit wasn't impressive. It was just consistent every single payday for years without a single manual decision required after the initial setup. I tested this against my own previous approach once, out of curiosity, manually moving money to savings whenever I remembered for a few months. I remembered roughly half the time. Automation remembered every single time, with 0 exceptions, 0 excuses, and 0 vulnerability to whatever mood I happened to be in on a given payday. Micro-habit 7. Keeping an emergency fund somewhere mildly inconvenient to access, a separate bank entirely, no debit card attached, nothing one tap away on a phone. Friction was the entire point. Money that's too easy to reach gets reached for constantly, for reasons that feel urgent in the moment, and rarely actually are. I genuinely tested my own resolve once, convinced something qualified as an emergency that, in hindsight, was just an unusually persuasive want, wearing an urgent costume. The 2 extra days it took to actually transfer the money out gave me exactly enough time to realize the want had already started fading on its own. The inconvenience wasn't a flaw in the system. It was, quietly, the entire system. Imagine the scene with me. 11 at night, phone glowing in a dark living room, absolutely certain that a particular item is not just wanted, but urgently, almost medically required. I open the app for the inconvenient bank, type in a username I don't have memorized, fail the password twice, get locked out for 15 minutes. By the time I'm back in, the medical emergency has resolved itself into mild curiosity about what I was even thinking. The bank's terrible app design saved me more money than any financial advisor ever has. Micro habit 8. Rounding every purchase up and quietly sweeping the difference into savings automatically. Coffee for $4 and change became $5, with the spare bit swept away without me lifting a finger. Individually meaningless. Across years and thousands of small purchases, it added up to a surprisingly substantial number I never once consciously felt myself contributing to. I forgot this habit was even running for long stretches at a time, which is more or less the entire appeal of it. Checking that specific account after not looking at it for the better part of a year felt almost like finding money I didn't know I had. Even though technically every single cent of it had come directly from spending I'd already done anyway. Micro habit 9. Saving the overwhelming majority of every windfall, every bonus, every tax refund, every unexpected check, instead of treating it as found money meant for spending. Windfalls feel different from regular income, psychologically, almost like monopoly money that arrived from nowhere and therefore doesn't count the same way a paycheck does. I forced myself to treat it exactly the same, which meant most of it went straight into savings or investments before the treat-yourself impulse ever got a vote. A decent-sized bonus landed one year right as a tempting vacation deal happened to be sitting in my inbox, the timing almost suspiciously perfect. I let myself keep a small slice of that bonus for something fun, deliberately, and redirected the rest before I had time to negotiate with myself about it further. The vacation happened. So did the saving. Neither one canceled the other out, which was sort of the entire point of drawing that line in advance instead of deciding in the moment. Micro habit 10. Checking total net worth once a month, not just a checking account balance, because a checking balance tells you almost nothing useful about whether you're actually moving forward. The first time I calculated it honestly, assets minus debts, all of it, the number was smaller and more sobering than I expected. Watching that specific number climb slowly, month after month, became a far better motivator than any single account balance ever managed to be on its own. A checking balance is a snapshot of the last 2 weeks. Net worth is the actual scoreboard, the only number that honestly reflects whether habits like these are working or just feel like they're working. I keep the tracking deliberately simple, the same handful of accounts updated on the same day each month, no spreadsheet elaborate enough to become its own procrastination project. I do this ritual every month sitting at the same kitchen chair, coffee going cold beside the laptop, occasionally narrating the numbers out loud to absolutely nobody, like a man doing his own quiet financial weather report. Investments up slightly, mortgage down slightly. Emergency fund suspiciously untouched, as it should be. My dog has heard this report more times than my wife has, and shows considerably less interest in either direction. The first 10 micro habits got money in the door and kept it from leaking back out. The next 5 are where that money actually started working harder than I was, which is the entire point of investing and the part most guys overcomplicate until it stops happening at all. Micro habit 11. Investing automatically every single paycheck, regardless of what the market happened to be doing that particular week. No trying to time a dip. No waiting for some imaginary perfect entry point that always seems to exist in hindsight and never in the present moment. The same amount, the same day, whether the market was up, down, or sideways, for years on end. I remember sitting through one particularly ugly stretch, watching the number on my statement drop in a way that made my stomach genuinely tighten. The automated contribution went out anyway, on schedule, completely indifferent to how I felt that week. That stretch turned out, in hindsight, to be one of the better buying windows of the entire run. I didn't know that at the time. The habit didn't need me to know it, it just needed me to keep showing up. Picture me that week if you want the full, slightly pathetic image. A grown man refreshing a portfolio app at 2 a.m, like it might say something different the 4th time. Then closing the laptop, lying very still in bed and whispering to the ceiling, "It's fine. It's fine. The number is just a number. It was not fine emotionally for about 11 days. The automated contribution didn't care about my emotional state in the slightest, which it turns out was exactly what I needed from it. Micro Habit 12. Maxing out every tax-advantaged account available before putting a single extra dollar anywhere else, starting with any employer match on the table. Walking past free money on the way to a regular brokerage account always struck me as one of the stranger financial habits I see otherwise smart guys make. Leaving an instant, guaranteed return sitting on the table in favor of something with no guarantee attached at all. I asked a younger coworker once why he wasn't contributing enough to capture his own employer match. The honest answer was simply that nobody had ever explained in plain terms what he was actually leaving behind by skipping it. He fixed it within the week once the math was spelled out clearly. Most guys aren't ignoring free money on purpose, they're just genuinely unaware it's sitting there. Micro Habit 13. Checking the portfolio on a fixed schedule, rarely instead of constantly, because daily checking does nothing but generate anxiety over noise that has zero bearing on a decades-long plan. I check it about once a quarter now. Anything more frequent just invites emotional decisions based on movements that'll be completely forgotten in 6 months anyway. I went through a phase, embarrassingly, of checking my portfolio multiple times a day, watching a number bounce around in ways that felt enormously significant in the moment and meant nothing whatsoever over any meaningful time frame. I eventually just deleted the app from my phone entirely, which sounds dramatic and was actually one of the more peaceful financial decisions I've ever made. Out of sight turned out to be exactly what my own worst impulses needed. During the worst of that phase, I checked it in line at the grocery store, at red lights once. Memorably, during my own son's school play. I glanced down at exactly the moment he delivered his one line as a tree. I missed the line. I did not miss the point. The app got deleted that same week, and somewhere out there, a tree-costumed 8-year-old still doesn't know how close he came to losing his father's attention to a quarterly earnings dip. Micro Habit 14. Increasing investment contributions automatically with every single raise, the same percentage every time, before Lifestyle had any chance to claim that increase first. This habit and the invisible raise habit from earlier work together, quietly compounding off each other, ensuring that growing income meant growing investments, rather than just a growing list of new things to spend it on. The two habits stacked on top of each other in a way I didn't fully appreciate until years later. I was comparing my own trajectory against guys who earned similarly but never built the second habit on top of the first. Same income growth. Wildly different outcomes simply because one of those income bumps kept feeding investments automatically and the other kept feeding an increasingly nicer version of the exact same life. Micro Habit 15. Keeping the actual investment strategy boring on purpose, broad index funds rather than chasing whatever specific stock or trend happened to be dominating conversation that particular month. I watched plenty of guys get excited about something flashy, make some money, lose more of it later. They ended up roughly where they started after years of stress that a boring, consistent approach would have spared them entirely. A coworker spent an entire stretch of years talking excitedly about whatever stock had his attention that quarter, riding genuine highs and uncomfortable lows. The pattern, charted out over time, looked almost exactly like a flat line with extra steps. I never once had an exciting story to tell about my own boring index funds at lunch. I also never once lost sleep over them, which strikes me, looking back, as the considerably better trade. The first 15 micro habits were mostly about money coming in and money being put to work. These next 5 are about the leaks, the small, steady ways money quietly walks out the door disguised as completely normal, reasonable spending. Micro Habit 16. Waiting a short fixed period before any non-essential purchase above a certain size, no exceptions, regardless of how urgent it felt in the moment. Most of what felt urgent on a Tuesday felt considerably less urgent by the following week. The habit wasn't about denying myself things. It was about making sure desire survived contact with a few days of actual thought before money changed hands. A particular jacket comes to mind, one I was completely convinced I needed standing in a store, the kind of want that feels almost physical in the moment. By the time the waiting period expired, I genuinely couldn't remember what had felt so urgent about it. I still don't own that jacket. I don't think about it either, which tells you most of what you need to know about how real that urgency actually was. Picture me in that store, if you will, performing what I can only describe as a one-man Broadway production about why this specific jacket would fundamentally change my life. I tried it on 3 times. I checked the mirror at an angle clearly designed to make myself look more deserving of the jacket. I left without it, drove home composing increasingly elaborate justifications in my head. By Thursday, I had completely forgotten the jacket existed. The mirror angle, the Broadway production, all of it gone, replaced by absolutely nothing of consequence. Micro-habit 17, cooking the overwhelming majority of meals at home instead of treating takeout as a daily convenience. This one alone, repeated for years, quietly outpaced almost every other individual habit on this entire list in terms of raw dollars saved. Food is something every single person buys every single day, which means small differences compound at a pace most other categories can't match. I never once thought of myself as someone deprived of restaurants. I just treated them as occasional, deliberate choices instead of a default fallback for any night that felt slightly too tired to cook. The difference between occasional and default turned out to be worth considerably more over years than any single habit on this entire list, simply because of how relentlessly often the decision repeats itself. Micro-habit 18, refusing to upgrade lifestyle every time someone nearby upgraded theirs. A neighbor's new car, a coworker's bigger house, a friend's exotic vacation, none of it triggered an automatic response from me to match it. This required actively noticing the comparison happening in real time and consciously declining to act on it, which got easier with practice but never became entirely automatic. A neighbor pulled into his driveway one afternoon with a vehicle that, I'll admit, made something in my chest tighten slightly with envy for about 30 seconds. I noticed the feeling, named it silently, and let it pass without converting it into a decision. 30 seconds of mild envy is a perfectly reasonable price to pay for not owing a bank a payment for the next 6 years. I stood at my own mailbox watching him park it, doing the exact facial expression of a man pretending to check his mail while actually conducting a full appraisal. He gave me a friendly wave. I gave a friendly wave back, internally reciting the math on a 60-month auto loan like a man reciting a prayer. The envy passed somewhere around the time I remembered I'd be parking my own, fully paid-off vehicle 2 driveways over in approximately 90 seconds, completely free of any monthly conversation with a bank. Micro-habit 19. Buying fewer, better things deliberately instead of replacing cheap versions of the same item repeatedly over the years. A genuinely good pair of boots, properly cared for, outlasted 3 cheap pairs and ended up costing less overall while performing better the entire time. This habit required upfront cash that occasionally felt uncomfortable, paired with the patience to actually calculate the long-term math instead of just flinching at the sticker price. I did the actual math on those boots once, out of curiosity, adding up what I'd previously spent replacing cheap pairs every year or two against the cost of one pair built to last considerably longer. The cheap approach lost decisively once you accounted for the full stretch of years rather than just the sticker shock of any single purchase. Cheap things being cheap repeatedly turns out to be more expensive than expensive things being expensive once. Micro-habit 20. Tracking every single dollar spent in detail for 1 full month twice a year as a kind of periodic audit rather than a permanent daily chore. Most months ran on autopilot, the habits already doing their job quietly in the background. Twice a year, I forced myself to look closely anyway, catching small leaks before they had time to become large ones. I almost skipped this one entirely a couple years back, telling myself the system was running fine without the audit. That particular audit caught a duplicate subscription I'd somehow been paying for under two different names for nearly a year, neither one obviously labeled enough to notice in passing. Permanent tracking would have burned out years ago. Twice-a-year tracking has caught nearly every meaningful leak without ever becoming exhausting enough to abandon. The first 20 micro-habits were almost entirely mechanical, the actual mechanics of money moving correctly through a life. These final 5 are different. They're less about spreadsheets and more about the kind of man doing the spreadsheets, because the mechanics only hold up if the person running them is actually built to sustain them for years. Micro-habit 21. Having honest, regular conversations about money with my wife, not just when something went wrong, but as a normal, ongoing part of how we operated as a team. We picked a specific evening each month, nothing dramatic, just an actual check-in where numbers got discussed openly, instead of assumed or avoided. Couples who fight about money are common. Couples who never talk about it at all just fight about something else instead, usually something with money quietly buried underneath it. Those monthly conversations were boring for the first year or so, honestly. Two people reviewing numbers that mostly hadn't changed much from the month before. The boredom was the entire point looking back. We'd built a habit that didn't depend on a crisis to justify its own existence. When an actual crisis eventually did show up, the conversation it required wasn't a foreign skill we suddenly had to learn under pressure. Picture it. Same couch, same night, same 2 mugs of decaf, my wife with a notepad she insists on using, despite the existence of every spreadsheet ever invented. Some months, the entire meeting lasted 4 minutes. Everything fine? Everything fine. Good. What's for dinner? It was, by any reasonable definition, one of the least romantic recurring events in our marriage, and also, somehow, one of the ones that's quietly done the most for it. Micro-habit 22. Being deliberate about who I spent time around, financially speaking, without becoming insufferable about it. Spending more time with guys who treated money thoughtfully and, gradually, less time with guys whose entire financial personality revolved around impressing each other. Nobody announced this shift out loud. It just happened, slowly, the way most meaningful shifts in a friend group tend to happen. I'm not suggesting anybody cut friends out of their life over a leased car, to be clear. I'm describing something quieter, just naturally gravitating toward conversations about index funds and side projects instead of conversations about whose truck had the better trim package that month. The people around you shape what feels normal more than almost anything else, usually without either of you noticing it happening in real time. Micro-habit 23. Defining an actual number for enough in writing instead of chasing an undefined, ever-receding target forever. Without that number, more always feels like the correct answer, indefinitely, regardless of how much has already been accumulated. With it, there's an actual finish line to certain kinds of striving, freeing up energy for things money was never going to solve anyway. Writing that number down felt strange the first time, almost presumptuous, like declaring a ceiling on ambition itself. It wasn't that. It was simply naming a target specific enough to actually hit, instead of vaguely chasing more forever. A goal that, by definition, can never actually be reached because it was never specific enough to reach in the first place. Micro-habit 24. Treating sleep, health, and relationships as financial assets, not separate categories unrelated to money. A health crisis avoided through decent habits is a financial habit, even though it doesn't show up on any spreadsheet labeled that way. A marriage that survives because both people showed up for it consistently avoided one of the single most expensive events a man's finances can go through, Micro habit 25, the final one. Explaining these habits out loud to someone else whenever the opportunity came up naturally. My own kids, a younger coworker, a buddy going through a rough financial stretch. Teaching something forces you to actually understand why it works instead of just doing it on autopilot. And every single explanation I've given over the years has, quietly, reinforced my own grip on the habit being explained. There's a strange kind of accountability built into teaching something you're not perfectly consistent with yourself. Explaining the waiting period habit to my own son, watching him actually apply it, made backsliding on it myself feel considerably more hypocritical than it would have felt in private. The habit of teaching turned out to be a kind of insurance policy on all the other 24, keeping me honest about practicing what I'd already started preaching. He used it against me once, gloriously, standing in an electronics store, watching me reach for something I clearly hadn't planned on buying that day. "Dad, the waiting period," said with the smug confidence of a teenager who has just discovered leverage over a parent for the first time in his life. I put the item down. I have never been more annoyed or more proud in the same exact moment. The habit of teaching turned out to be a kind of insurance policy on all the other 24, keeping me honest about practicing what I'd already started preaching. Hold on to that thought, because it actually says something about every single one of these 25. If you stayed with me through all 25 of these, thank you, genuinely, especially since none of them individually deserved a standing ovation. Subscribe to this channel if this kind of honest, unglamorous breakdown is useful to you. There's a lot more practical, specific content like this coming, built from things that actually worked rather than things that sound impressive in a title. I considered, briefly, trimming this list down to a tighter, punchier 10 for the sake of a cleaner video. It felt dishonest. The actual truth of how this happened involved 25 separate small decisions, not 10 dramatic ones. Rounding that number down for the sake of a better-sounding title would have been exactly the kind of shortcut this entire video argues against. While you're here, tell me in the comments which of these 25 you're already doing, and which one genuinely surprised you. I'm especially curious whether the mindset habits near the end landed differently than the mechanical ones near the beginning, because I suspect they do for most guys watching this. My own guess is the money conversations with a partner get skipped most often, since that one requires another person's cooperation and not just your own discipline. I'd genuinely rather hear it from you than just assume my own guess holds up. Here's what struck me most, putting all 25 of these in one place for the first time. Not one of them alone made me a millionaire by 35. If you isolated any single habit on this list and asked whether it could account for 7 figures on its own, the honest answer would be no, not even close. The actual number came from all 25 operating together quietly for over a decade, compounding off each other in ways that were invisible, week to week, and unmistakable looking backward. It's a little like asking which single brick built a house. None of them did, technically, and all of them did, collectively, in a way that makes the question slightly beside the point. Pull any one habit out of this list, and the remaining 24 still probably get you somewhere good. Pull out enough of them, though, and the whole structure starts to wobble in ways that wouldn't be obvious until considerably later. If you're the kind of guy who likes a tidy mental image, here's mine. 25 bricks, none particularly impressive on their own. A few of them, frankly, a little ugly, like the rounding up spare change one, which is essentially financial couch cushion archaeology dressed up in a savings account. Stack all 25 in the right order, mortar them together with about a decade of patience. You end up with something that looks, from a distance, suspiciously like a house Gary the financial advisor would be impressed by. That's the part most financial content skips entirely in my experience. People want the one trick, the single hack, the secret nobody else knows. There isn't one. There's a long list of unremarkable decisions repeated consistently long enough that the math eventually does something that feels, from a distance, almost like magic. It isn't magic. It's just 25 small things, compounding quietly, for years, while life kept happening around them. I think the actual lesson here has less to do with any specific habit and more to do with the willingness to keep doing unremarkable things for a remarkably long time, without needing constant proof they were working. Most of these habits produced no visible reward for months, sometimes years, at a stretch. The reward eventually showed up anyway, on its own schedule, completely indifferent to how patient I felt while waiting for it. That patience is, I think, the genuinely unteachable part of all this. I can hand you all 25 of these habits today, in full detail, and you could start every single one of them by tomorrow morning. Whether you're still doing all 25 of them in a decade, on a day when none of them feel like they're producing anything worth mentioning. That's the actual variable that decides whether this video ends up meaning anything to you or just entertaining you for 20 minutes. That financial advisor's office, the one I mentioned at the very start of this video, the net worth statement, the number sitting there in 7 figures. I think about that moment differently now than I did sitting in the chair that day. At the time it felt like an arrival, the finish line of some long, invisible race I hadn't fully realized I was running. Gary, if you're somehow watching this, you were right about more than the spreadsheet. You also recommended a sandwich place across the street that, I want it on record, was outrageously overpriced for what amounted to a fairly average turkey club. The 7-figure statement I trust completely. The lunch recommendation, considerably less so. The advisor actually said something I've thought about often since, almost in passing. Most of his clients who reach this point seem somehow less surprised by the number itself than by how little the morning felt different from any other morning. I remember nodding along at the time without fully understanding what he meant. I understand it considerably better now. Looking back now, it wasn't a finish line at all. It was just the day the math finally became visible enough to actually see, after years of being invisible, while it quietly did its work in the background. The habits didn't stop the day that statement printed. They're still running today, the exact same 25, mostly unchanged because nothing about hitting a number changes whether the math still works. I drove home from that office and didn't tell anyone for almost a week, oddly enough. Not my wife, not my closest friends, nobody. I think I needed time to sit with it privately first, to understand what it actually meant, before trying to explain it to anyone else, including, frankly, myself. When I did finally tell my wife, the conversation lasted maybe 2 minutes before we were back to discussing what was actually for dinner. Not because the number didn't matter to her, because the number, by that point, had already stopped being the interesting part of our life together. The interesting part had been all 25 small things we'd been quietly doing as a team for over a decade, and the number was just the receipt those things eventually produced. What it meant, once I'd actually sat with it long enough, wasn't freedom from work or some dramatic lifestyle shift. The habits that got me there were too deeply built into how I operated for the number itself to suddenly change much of anything. I still cook most nights. I still negotiate every offer. I still wait before non-essential purchases. The number changed. The man doing the 25 things that built it stayed almost exactly the same. If anything, hitting that number mostly just confirmed something I'd suspected for years without quite being able to prove it. The habits were never really about the destination. They were just who I'd slowly become, somewhere along the way, while focused on something considerably more boring than a number on a page. I genuinely couldn't tell you the exact moment any one of these 25 habits stopped being effort and became identity instead. Just a guy who does these specific things, the same way some men are just guys who get up early or guys who always call their mother back. Somewhere in there, doing them stopped requiring willpower at all. They just became what I do, which I suspect is the actual finish line, nobody tells you to look for. If any of these 25 landed with you tonight, do a few things before you go. Follow this channel, because there's more honest, practical breakdowns like this coming, built from things that actually compound, rather than things that sound impressive for 30 seconds. Share this with someone starting out, someone who could use 25 small starting points instead of one overwhelming vague goal that never quite turns into action. I genuinely believe most guys don't need another inspirational speech about getting rich. They need a specific list, like this one, broken into pieces small enough that starting tonight feels possible instead of overwhelming. Pick one, just one, out of all 25. Start there. The other 24 will still be waiting whenever you're ready for them. Leave a comment telling me which of these 25 you're starting with tonight, and tell me what you want covered next, because that's genuinely how this channel keeps getting built, one unremarkable compounding video at a time. I'll see you in the next one.